A tired waitress receives a mysterious tip that changes everything. What follows is a revolution of kindness that could save a struggling diner and transform an entire neighborhood. But the true identity of the tipper is revealed, leading to an unexpected confrontation that will determine the fate of a community. Discover how a small act can trigger a movement, and why kindness can be the most powerful force we have. Welcome, enjoy, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Sarah's weathered hands trembled slightly as she poured coffee into a chipped mug, the aroma momentarily masking the weariness etched on her face. At 55, she had spent more than half her life working at Joe's Diner, a cozy yet worn establishment nestled between towering skyscrapers in the heart of the city. The morning rush was in full swing, a cacophony of clinking cutlery and murmured conversations filling the air. Sarah's eyes darted between tables, her mind already calculating the meager tips that would barely cover this month's rent. Outside, the city bustled with its usual indifference. Suits power-walked past the diner's steamy windows, their eyes fixed on smartphones, oblivious to the life unfolding around them. Sarah often wondered if they even noticed the changing seasons anymore. She sighed, remembering a time when neighbors greeted each other on the street, when the community felt less like a collection of strangers and more like an extended family. The world had changed, and sometimes Sarah felt like she was being left behind. As she refilled the coffee of Mr. Henderson, a regular whose name she knew, but who had never bothered to learn hers, Sarah's thoughts drifted to her mother. At 83, Margaret was becoming increasingly frail, relying on Sarah for everything from medication to meals. The weight of responsibility pressed down on Sarah's shoulders, making each step feel like a marathon. She wondered, not for the first time, how long she could keep juggling her mother's care with the demanding hours at the diner. Tom, the diner's owner, barked an order from the kitchen, snapping Sarah back to reality. His gruff demeanor had only worsened over the years, matching the gradual decline of the once bustling eatery. Sarah plastered on a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes and turned to greet a new customer. In this moment, she felt every one of her 55 years, each laugh line and callus a testament to a life of hard work and unfulfilled dreams. Yet, as always, Sarah squared her shoulders and soldiered on. She had bills to pay, a mother to care for, and customers to serve. Life hadn't turned out the way she'd imagined all those years ago when she first tied on her apron. But Sarah wasn't one to dwell on what-ifs. She took a deep breath, straightened her name tag, and approached the next table. Little did she know that her life was about to change with her very next customer. The bell above the door chimed, announcing the arrival of a new patron. Sarah glanced up, her practiced smile already in place, to see a man in his early 60s settling into a booth by the window. There was something vaguely familiar about him, but in a diner that had served generations, faces often blurred together. She approached his table, notepad at the ready, reciting the daily specials with well-worn cheerfulness. The man ordered a simple breakfast, eggs over easy, whole wheat toast, and a black coffee, his eyes never leaving the menu. As Sarah turned to place the order, she couldn't shake the feeling that the man was watching her. It wasn't an uncomfortable sensation, more like the weight of consideration. She brushed it off, chalking it up to the paranoia that came with years of dealing with all types in the service industry. The morning progressed as usual, a dance of coffee pots and plates, of, "How are you, hun?" and, "Can I get you anything else?" The man ate quietly, his eyes occasionally drifting to the street outside. When it came time for him to leave, Sarah approached his table with the check, her mind already on the next task. The man smiled warmly, handing her a folded bill. "Keep the change," he said softly, standing up and donning his coat. Sarah murmured her thanks, her autopilot gratitude kicking in. It wasn't until the bell chimed again, signaling his departure, that she unfolded the bill. Her eyes widened in disbelief. A crisp $5 bill sat atop the payment for his meal. Blinking rapidly, Sarah noticed a small note scrawled on a napkin left behind. "Your kindness is seen. Pay it forward." She read the words once, twice, 3 times, her heart racing. In all her years of waitressing, she'd never received such a generous tip, let alone one accompanied by a mysterious message. As she clutched the money and note, a warmth spread through her chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. For the first time in a long while, Sarah felt seen. Truly seen. The rest of her shift passed in a blur, the $5 tip burning a hole in her pocket. As she hung up her apron at the end of the day, Tom emerged from the kitchen, his perpetual frown deepening the lines on his face. "Don't forget to restock the ketchup bottles before you leave," he grumbled, barely looking at her. Sarah nodded, the weight of the unexpected tip suddenly feeling like a secret treasure. She left the diner that evening with a lightness in her step, wondering what to do with this unexpected windfall and the cryptic message that accompanied it. On her way home, Sarah passed Mrs. Johnson's apartment. The elderly woman lived alone, her children scattered across the country, too busy with their own lives to visit often. Sarah usually exchanged pleasantries with her in the hallway, but today, an idea began to form. Instead of heading straight to her own apartment, Sarah detoured to the small florist on the corner. The bell tinkled as she entered, and the sweet scent of flowers enveloped her. She selected a small bouquet of cheerful daisies, their yellow centers like tiny suns. With trembling hands, Sarah knocked on Mrs. Johnson's door. When the older woman answered, confusion evident on her face, Sarah simply held out the flowers. I thought you might like these," she stammered, suddenly feeling foolish. But as Mrs. Johnson's eyes lit up, a smile spreading across her wrinkled face, Sarah felt a warmth bloom in her chest. "Oh, my dear," Mrs. Johnson breathed, taking the flowers with reverent hands. "How did you know daisies are my favorite?" Sarah hadn't known, but in that moment, it felt like a sign. As Sarah helped Mrs. Johnson put the flowers in water, listening to her stories about her late husband's penchant for surprise bouquets, she felt a shift inside herself. The simple act of buying flowers had created a connection, bridging the gap of loneliness that seemed to permeate their building. When she finally left Mrs. Johnson's apartment, the older woman's grateful smile stayed with her. Sarah realized that the mysterious tipper had given her more than just money. He had given her a reminder of the power of kindness. That night, as Sarah prepared a simple dinner for herself and her mother, her mind kept drifting back to the events of the day. The $5 tip, the note, Mrs. Johnson's delight at the flowers, it all swirled together in her thoughts. As she helped her mother into bed, gently tucking the covers around her frail form, Sarah felt a renewed sense of purpose. She'd always tried to be kind, but now she wondered if there was more she could do, more ways she could spread that kindness in her little corner of the world. Lying in bed that night, Sarah made a decision. Starting tomorrow, she would look for opportunities to pay forward the kindness she had received. It didn't have to be grand gestures. Even small acts could make a difference, as she had seen with Mrs. Johnson. As she drifted off to sleep, Sarah felt a sense of anticipation she hadn't experienced in years. Tomorrow would be the start of something new, something that could change not just her life, but the lives of those around her. Little did she know just how far-reaching the effects of her decision would be. The next morning, Sarah arrived at Joe's diner with a newfound spring in her step. As she tied her apron, she caught Tom's questioning glance but merely smiled in response. The breakfast rush began, and Sarah found herself really looking at her customers for the first time in years. She noticed the young man in the corner, his tie askew and dark circles under his eyes, clearly stressed about something. When she brought his coffee, she added a small note on his napkin. "You've got this. Have a great day." Throughout the day, Sarah continued her small acts of kindness. She offered a sympathetic ear to a lonely widower, gave an extra slice of pie to a pregnant woman craving sweets, and even managed to coax a smile from grumpy Mr. Henderson. Her colleagues watched with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "What's gotten into you?" asked Marge, another waitress, as Sarah hummed while refilling salt shakers. Sarah just shrugged, a secretive smile playing on her lips. By the end of the week, regulars were starting to notice the change in atmosphere. The diner seemed brighter somehow, filled with more laughter and friendly chatter. Even Tom emerged from the kitchen more often, his perpetual frown softening into something almost resembling a smile. Sarah overheard snippets of conversation, people discussing good deeds they'd done or received, inspired by the positivity they felt at the diner. However, not everyone was on board with Sarah's mission. Some customers grumbled about the extra attention others were getting, while a few of her co-workers accused her of brown-nosing. Sarah felt her resolve waver in the face of their negativity. Was she really making a difference, or just fooling herself? As she wiped down tables that evening, she wondered if it was worth continuing her campaign of kindness in the face of such resistance. Just as doubt was creeping in, a young girl approached Sarah, tugging on her apron. "Excuse me," she said shyly, "but I wanted to thank you for being so nice to my mom yesterday. She was having a bad day, but you made her smile." Sarah felt her heart swell. This was why she was doing this. The small moments, the tiny sparks of joy she could bring to others. With renewed determination, she decided to press on, regardless of the naysayers. The ripples of kindness were spreading, and Sarah was eager to see where they would lead. Weeks passed, and Sarah found herself caught in a delicate balancing act. Her small acts of kindness at the diner were spreading, creating a ripple effect in the community. Regular customers began paying it forward, buying coffee for strangers, or leaving encouraging notes. The atmosphere in the diner had transformed, becoming a warm haven in the otherwise indifferent city. Sarah's heart swelled with pride every time she witnessed a spontaneous act of generosity. However, as her focus shifted to spreading kindness, Sarah's personal struggles intensified. Her mother's health took a turn for the worse, requiring expensive medication that stretched Sarah's already thin budget to the breaking point. She found herself staying up late, poring over bills and trying to make the numbers work. The stress began to show in the dark circles under her eyes and the slight tremor in her hands as she poured coffee. One particularly difficult morning, Sarah stood in the pharmacy, staring at the prescription in her hand and the meager contents of her wallet. She thought of the tip jar at the diner, now fuller than ever thanks to the generosity of inspired customers. The temptation to dip into it for her mother's medication was overwhelming. Tears pricked at her eyes as she wrestled with the moral dilemma. Was it wrong to use the money for her own needs when it had been given in the spirit of kindness? As Sarah debated, she felt a gentle tap on her shoulder. She turned to find Mrs. Johnson smiling up at her, leaning on her cane. "My dear," the older woman said, her eyes twinkling, "I hope you don't mind, but I overheard. Please let me help. You've brought so much joy to this old woman's life." Before Sarah could protest, Mrs. Johnson was already speaking with the pharmacist. Overwhelmed with gratitude, Sarah realized that sometimes allowing others to help was its own form of kindness. Back at the diner, Sarah noticed Tom watching her more closely. His gruff exterior seemed to be cracking, revealing glimpses of concern. One slow afternoon, he approached her as she was restocking napkins. "Everything okay at home?" he asked, his voice gruff but tinged with genuine worry. Sarah hesitated, then found herself pouring out her troubles. To her surprise, Tom listened attentively, nodding in understanding. "You're not alone in this," he said finally, patting her awkwardly on the shoulder. "We'll figure something out." As he walked away, Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Perhaps the kindness she had been spreading was finally coming back to her in unexpected ways. Word of the kindness diner, as some locals had begun to call it, spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Sarah watched in amazement as new faces began to appear among the regulars, drawn by rumors of the warm atmosphere and spontaneous acts of generosity. She overheard conversations about people inspired to start their own kindness initiatives in their workplaces or apartment buildings. The movement was growing beyond the walls of Joe's diner, and Sarah felt a mix of pride and disbelief that it had all started with a simple $5 tip. Tom, usually ensconced in the kitchen, began to spend more time in the dining area, observing the changes with a thoughtful expression. One slow afternoon, he approached Sarah as she was refilling sugar containers. "You've really turned this place around," he said gruffly, avoiding eye contact. "Customers keep telling me how much they enjoy coming here now." Sarah smiled, touched by the rare compliment. "It's not just me, Tom," she replied. "Everyone's contributing to this atmosphere." As the days passed, Sarah noticed a softening in Tom's demeanor. He started greeting customers by name, occasionally even cracking a joke. The harsh lines of his face seemed to smooth out, years of stress melting away. One morning, Sarah caught him slipping an extra muffin onto a young mother's plate, winking conspiratorially at her toddler. Their eyes met, and for the first time, Sarah saw a genuine smile spread across Tom's face. In that moment, she realized that the kindness movement had touched him too, in ways she hadn't anticipated. The diner became a hub of community activity. A local book club started meeting there weekly, filling a corner with animated literary discussions. A group of retirees made it their daily hangout, sharing stories and laughter over endless cups of coffee. Even the local high school students began to drop by after classes, drawn by the welcoming atmosphere and Tom's newly introduced study special, a discounted meal for students with textbooks in tow. However, just as things seemed to be looking up, a shadow fell over the diner. Sarah overheard Tom on the phone, his voice raised in frustration. As he hung up, he noticed her concerned look. With a heavy sigh, he beckoned her over. "The landlord's raising the rent," he said, his earlier smile replaced by a worried frown. "I don't know how we're going to manage it." Sarah felt her heart sink. Just when they had created something beautiful, it was all in danger of falling apart. But as she looked around at the bustling diner, filled with smiling faces and acts of kindness, she knew they couldn't give up without a fight. The kindness revolution they had started was too important to let go. The news of the rent increase spread through the diner like a chill wind, dampening the warm atmosphere that had become its hallmark. Sarah watched with a heavy heart as Tom huddled with their accountant, shaking his head at column after column of numbers. The reality was stark. Despite the increase in customers, the diner's margins were still razor-thin. The proposed rent hike would push them firmly into the red. Regulars picked up on the change in mood, their concerned whispers adding to the undercurrent of worry. Mrs. Johnson, now a daily visitor, patted Sarah's hand as she refilled her tea. "What's troubling you, dear?" she asked, her eyes sharp despite her age. Sarah hesitated, then confided in the older woman. Mrs. Johnson's face fell, but then a determined glint appeared in her eye. "We can't let this place go," she declared. "It's become the heart of our community." That evening, as Sarah wiped down tables, she overheard snippets of conversation that gave her pause. Customers were brainstorming ways to help save the diner. A local lawyer offered to look over the lease for free. A group of college students suggested a social media campaign. Even Mr. Henderson, once so gruff, was talking about reaching out to his contacts in real estate. Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. The kindness they had cultivated was being reflected back to them tenfold. Tom, who had been uncharacteristically quiet all day, finally approached Sarah as she was hanging up her apron. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice low and determined. "We can't let this place go without a fight. It's not just a business anymore, is it?" Sarah nodded, feeling a surge of hope. "What do you have in mind?" she asked. Tom's eyes twinkled with a hint of his old mischief. "I think it's time we showed this neighborhood just how much Joe's Diner means to all of us." As Sarah left the diner that night, her mind whirled with possibilities. The diner had become more than just a place to eat. It was a beacon of hope in the neighborhood. She couldn't bear the thought of losing it. With renewed determination, she decided it was time to take action. Tomorrow, she and Tom would start organizing a community meeting. If they were going to save Joe's Diner, they would do it together, just as they had built this movement of kindness together. The next morning, Sarah arrived early, determined to start planning with Tom before the breakfast rush. She found him in his tiny office, poring over paperwork. "Tom," she began hesitantly, "I have some ideas about how we might handle the rent situation." He looked up, eyebrows raised. As Sarah outlined her thoughts for a community meeting, she was surprised to see a smile slowly spread across Tom's face. "Sarah," he interrupted gently, "there's something I need to tell you." Tom leaned back in his chair, his eyes twinkling with an unfamiliar light. "Do you remember that $5 tip you got a few months ago? The one that started all this?" Sarah nodded, confused by the sudden change in topic. Tom's smile widened. "That was me," he confessed. Sarah's jaw dropped in disbelief. Tom chuckled at her expression. "I'd been watching you for years, seeing how hard you worked, how kind you were to everyone despite your own struggles. I wanted to do something to help, but I didn't know how." As Tom continued his story, Sarah felt as if the world had shifted on its axis. He explained how he'd been inspired by her reaction to the tip, how he'd watched in amazement as she turned that small gesture into a movement that transformed the entire diner. "I've owned this place for 30 years, Tom said, his voice thick with emotion, "but I've never been prouder of it than I am now. You've reminded me why I got into this business in the first place." Sarah's mind reeled as she processed this revelation. All this time she'd thought of Tom as a gruff, disinterested boss. Now, she saw him in a new light, as the catalyst for the very change she'd been championing. As they sat in companionable silence, both lost in thought. Sarah realized that this changed everything. They weren't just fighting to save a business. They were fighting to preserve a vision of community and kindness that they both shared. With renewed determination, they began to plan their next move. The community meeting would go ahead, but now with a new purpose. It wasn't just about saving the diner. It was about celebrating the spirit of kindness that had taken root there and spreading it even further. As they worked, bouncing ideas off each other with growing excitement, Sarah felt a surge of hope. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew that together, they could face them. The kindness revolution they had started was just beginning. The following week was a whirlwind of activity. Sarah and Tom worked tirelessly, reaching out to regulars and local businesses for support. They decided to host a community event at the diner, showcasing the impact it had on the neighborhood. Mrs. Johnson took charge of spreading the word, her network of friends proving invaluable. The college students who frequented the diner set up a social media campaign, their hashtag #SaveJoe'sDiner quickly gaining traction. As the day of the event approached, setbacks began to pile up. The catering company they'd hired backed out at the last minute, citing a double booking. The sound system they'd borrowed malfunctioned during testing, emitting ear-splitting feedback instead of music. Even the weather seemed to be against them, with forecasts predicting heavy rain on the day of the event. Sarah felt her optimism wavering, the weight of potential failure pressing down on her shoulders. But each time she considered giving up, a regular would pop in with words of encouragement or an offer to help, rekindling her determination. The local bakery, hearing about the catering issue, offered to provide pastries at cost. A retired sound engineer who lived down the block volunteered to fix the audio system. And when Sarah mentioned the weather concerns to Mrs. Johnson, the older woman simply smiled and said, "Rain or shine, we'll be there. This community has weathered worse storms than this." Tom surprised everyone with his enthusiasm and creativity. The man who had once barely left his kitchen was now front and center, coordinating volunteers and brainstorming ideas. He reached out to his old culinary school contacts, securing donations of food and equipment. His gruff exterior had melted away entirely, replaced by a passionate advocate for the diner and its mission. Sarah watched in amazement as he charmed local reporters into covering their story, his eyes shining with a newfound purpose. The night before the event, Sarah stayed late at the diner, double-checking every detail. As she stood in the middle of the dining room, surrounded by posters and banners proclaiming the diner's importance to the community, she felt a mix of anxiety and hope. Tomorrow would determine the fate of Joe's Diner. As she turned to leave, her eye caught the spot where the mysterious $5 tip had started it all. She smiled, realizing that regardless of the outcome, they had already achieved something remarkable. They had turned a simple diner into a catalyst for kindness, and that was a legacy worth fighting for. The morning of the community event dawned gray and drizzly, matching Sarah's nervous mood. She arrived at the diner 2 hours early, her stomach in knots. To her surprise, Tom was already there, setting up tables and chairs with a determined set to his jaw. They worked in companionable silence, the patter of rain on the windows providing a soft backdrop to their preparations. As the scheduled start time approached, Sarah's anxiety grew. The rain had intensified, and the streets outside remained eerily empty. She exchanged a worried glance with Tom, who squeezed her shoulder reassuringly. "They'll come," he said, with more confidence than he probably felt. The minutes ticked by, and Sarah's heart sank as she watched the clock. Just as she was about to suggest they call it off, the bell above the door chimed. Mrs. Johnson hobbled in, shaking raindrops from her umbrella. "Did you think a little rain would keep me away?" she chuckled, settling into her usual booth. As if her arrival had broken a spell, more people began to trickle in. Regulars, neighbors, even a few unfamiliar faces drawn by the social media campaign. Soon, the diner was humming with conversation, the dreary weather outside forgotten. Sarah took a deep breath and stepped up to the makeshift podium they had set up. As she looked out at the sea of friendly faces, her nervousness melted away. She began to speak, her voice growing stronger as she shared the story of the diner, of the kindness movement it had sparked, and of the community it had fostered. As she spoke, she saw heads nodding, eyes glistening with emotion. She realized that Joe's Diner had become more than just a restaurant. It had become a symbol of hope and connection in their often disconnected urban lives. As Sarah concluded her speech, the diner erupted in applause. Tom stepped up next, his usual gruffness replaced by genuine emotion as he talked about his years running the diner and how the recent changes had reignited his passion for the business. One by one, community members stood up to share their own stories of how the diner and its kindness movement had impacted their lives. The atmosphere in the room was electric, filled with a sense of shared purpose and determination. Midway through the event, the bell chimed again, and a hush fell over the crowd. The building owner, Mr. Reeves, stepped in, shaking rain from his coat. Sarah felt her heart race as he made his way through the crowded diner, his expression unreadable. To everyone's surprise, he asked for a chance to speak. As he took the podium, Sarah held her breath, preparing for the worst. Mr. Reeves cleared his throat, looking out at the packed diner. "I came here today intending to explain why the rent increase was necessary," he began. "But listening to your stories, seeing this community you've built, it's made me reconsider." A murmur of hope rippled through the crowd. Mr. Reeves continued, "This diner clearly means more to this neighborhood than I realized. I propose we work together to find a solution that allows Joe's Diner to continue its important work." The diner erupted in cheers and applause. Sarah felt tears of relief and joy streaming down her face as Tom enveloped her in a bear hug. As the celebration continued around them, Sarah caught sight of Mrs. Johnson, who winked at her from her booth. In that moment, Sarah realized that their little movement had accomplished something truly remarkable. They hadn't just saved a diner. They had reminded an entire community of the power of kindness and connection. Mr. Reeves, caught up in the spirit of the moment, suggested forming a community council to oversee the diner's future. "We'll work out a fair rent agreement," he promised, "and find ways to ensure the diner remains a fixture in this neighborhood for years to come." The idea was met with enthusiastic approval, and soon, volunteers were stepping forward to be part of this new initiative. As the event wound down, Sarah found herself surrounded by well-wishers and supporters. The local newspaper reporter who had covered the story approached her, notepad in hand. "This is more than just a story about saving a local business," she said, her eyes bright with excitement. "You've started a movement here. Would you be willing to do a follow-up interview about the Kindness Initiative?" Sarah nodded, realizing that their little diner story was far from over. It was, in fact, just beginning a new chapter. In the weeks following the community event, Joe's Diner buzzed with renewed energy. Mr. Reeves had worked with Tom to create a sustainable rent agreement, ensuring the diner's future. The publicity from the event had drawn new customers from all over the city, eager to experience the famous Kindness Diner for themselves. Sarah watched with pride as the movement they had started continued to grow and evolve. Tom had undergone perhaps the most dramatic transformation. The once gruff owner now greeted every customer with a smile, often emerging from the kitchen to chat and share stories. He and Sarah had become partners in the truest sense, bouncing ideas off each other and dreaming up new ways to spread kindness throughout the community. The diner had become a hub for local charity events and community meetings, its walls now adorned with photos and notes from grateful patrons. The newly formed community council met regularly at the diner, working on initiatives to improve the neighborhood. Inspired by the diner's success, other local businesses had started their own kindness campaigns. The entire atmosphere of the community had shifted, becoming warmer and more connected. Sarah often marveled at how a single $5 tip had set off such a profound chain reaction. One quiet afternoon, as Sarah refilled the sugar containers, a young woman approached her. "Excuse me," she said. "Are you Sarah?" Sarah nodded, curious. The woman introduced herself as a journalist from a national magazine. "We've heard about what you've done here," she explained, her eyes shining with excitement. "We'd love to do a feature story on Joe's Diner and the kindness movement you've inspired. Would you be interested?" As the journalist outlined her ideas for the article, Sarah felt a sense of wonder wash over her. From a simple $5 tip to a national magazine feature, the journey seemed almost unbelievable. She thought back to that fateful day when a small act of kindness had sparked a revolution in her life and her community. As she agreed to the interview, Sarah realized that this wasn't an end, but a new beginning. The story of Joe's Diner and its lesson of kindness would now reach even further, touching lives far beyond their little corner of the city. And Sarah couldn't wait to see what new adventures and opportunities this next chapter would bring. I really hope you enjoyed the story. Please leave a comment with your views. I'm sure there will be new videos on this channel that will thrill you. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel Give it a like and activate the notification bell so you don't miss our next videos. Until next time.